Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight for this is the 6th Borton-Mosely Distinguished Lecture on Eurasia. And this is a series of talks jointly sponsored by the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and the Harriman Institute, both at Columbia University. I'm Myron Cohen, and I'm the director of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, which, since its establishment in 1949, has worked to expand research on East Asia, as well as to train new generations of specialists in this area. The Harriman Institute, founded in 1946 as the Russian Institute, is a leading center for the advancement of scholarship in the field of Russian and Eurasian studies. The Borton-Mosely lecturers commemorate Hugh Borton and Philip Mosely, two members of the founding generation of each of these institutes. And as our lecturer tonight, we are delighted to have Richard McGregor, Washington Bureau Chief of the Financial Times. He's an award-winning journalist. He was previously deputy news editor in London, Beijing bureau chief, and Shanghai correspondent for the Financial Times. Before that, he was the chief political correspondent, the Japan correspondent, and the China correspondent for the Australian. Last year, he received the Asia Society's Bernard Schwartz Prize for his book, The Party, The Secret World of China's Communist Rulers. And tonight, he will speak on the Chinese Communist Party, the U.S., and the year of selection and elections. Following his presentation, Harriman Institute faculty member Alexander Cooley will offer comments, followed by an audience question and answer session. Professor Cooley is the Toh Professor of Political Science at Barnard College and is the author of the forthcoming book, Great Games, Local Rules, the New Great Power Contest for Central Asia, which looks at the politics of U.S., Russia, China competition in that part of the world. Let me now turn the lectern over to our Borton-Mosely Distinguished Lecturer. Please join me in welcoming Richard McGregor.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Cohen, for that. I don't usually get called distinguished. Usually distinguished journalist is considered to be an oxymoron. Not in a bad way, but it's a great honour to be here. Some people suggest that I just should have thrown out whatever I'd written and just spoken about Bolshoi, but I only know what I read in the papers. But I might sort of put a little bit of that in the lecture as we go on. But in any case, the title of this talk about selections and elections, the former which we have in China and the latter in the US this year, one on the first Tuesday in November, if I'm right, in the US, and in China's case, anyone's guess. If the country is getting more transparent, then I guess we'll find out the vague dates about a month or so beforehand, and then from my experience, you usually start to measure when it's going to happen by the increase in the police presence in Beijing. But in any case, I stole that election title from the late Senator Jesse Helms, who years ago used to tell Emily Lau, who was the Hong Kong legislator and democracy agitator, that he always distinguished between selections and elections when he was looking at the territory's leadership. And when I lived in China and Hong Kong on and off for many years, I actually, me and I guess some of my colleagues used to enjoy and frankly approve of Jesse Helms rattling the cage on China and on issues like foreign policy and human rights. After about a year and a bit of covering US politics, I'm not so sure that I'd be so thrilled about Jesse Helms anymore. Living in China always made me much more right-wing. Living in the US might be making me make me swing a little bit back the other way. But the debate here seems to be so binary that you get into one camp and you seem to be locked into it. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about US domestic politics. I really want to start by looking and primarily focus on Chinese political system and the Communist Party. So in delivering talks like this, I often ask people to put up their hands and ask people, who here thinks that China is communist? Almost no, just a few people. I mean, I certainly know how Jesse Helms would have answered on that question, but it's understandable that many people are confused on a question like that. I mean, there's lots of jokes about the Chinese Communist Party as a result of that. Some people call it the world's biggest chamber of commerce. Other people call it the world's biggest mixed business. The head of a private equity firm in London last year was speaking about China, where, like a lot of private equity executives, he's very keen to invest in. And he said that he only understood the Communist Party when he realised that the Politburo was just like Goldman Sachs, because you had about 25 men, mainly men, who basically were in control of all the necessary information and, of course, on every side of every deal. China also, strangely enough, fits the old Soviet joke about the definition of communism, which some of you might remember, and the answer is communism is the longest path from capitalism to capitalism. So back to the initial question, is China communist? I think it's much more subtle than that. I mean, China is obviously not communist like the Soviet Union was, and a much better way to describe China, and this came from the Chinese ambassador to London, and he said China is not a communist country, but it has a communist government. Now, if you look at how China is governed, there's obviously a Chinese bureaucratic tradition of strong rule by the centre and all sorts of things that go with that. There's always been stories that, and a history that many people here would know a lot better than I about how Chinese emperors have tried to maintain the loyalty of their army officers by putting people in to spy on them. You know, you appoint people to positions according to stated moral principles and the like. You know, there's clearly a very nice fit between the traditional Chinese bureaucratic structure and the Communist Party, which now inhabits that. You know, the Communist Party didn't sort of land like an alien spaceship in the Chinese governmental structure. And ruling behind the screen has always had a long tradition in China. In the modern Chinese government, and this is something I'll speak about a little bit later, there's also lots of Western-style add-ons in the way that people are judged. It's what these ubiquitous management consultants call KPIs, or key performance indicators, which is why, you know, you've got some people describing China as market Leninism, other people describing it as McKinsey Leninism, because all these officials have, you know, all these different benchmarks that they're judged by and which they're meant to be promoted according to. Of course, it doesn't really happen like that, but they are at least in the system, and that's a good thing. But when I set out to write my book about 3-4 years ago now, what was really striking for me, and once I started to think about this topic, is that once you look past the sort of bureaucratic tradition, and once you look past the sort of more recent modernisation, that it is remarkable how traditional the Communist Party governing core in China still is. In other words, you can make out a good case that China is still run on Soviet hardware, which is a pretty remarkable thing, particularly when you go to China and you see what, it looks like 1890s robber baron capitalism at full throttle. But underneath that, or behind that, is a system which is basically still designed by Lenin. In other words, you have a very secretive party, a purely political organisation which sits atop the government and effectively controls the government. It's basically a law unto itself, and we can see that with the Borton-Mosely case this week. I'll come back to that. The party it's a self-governing and self-regulating elite, and if you read what the top party officials say themselves, it's far too often these days a self-enriching elite as well. Now, what basically does the party control in China these days? And the answer is, compared to 30, 35 years ago, much less than what it used to. So individual Chinese, especially in urban areas, have greater freedom than they have for decades, maybe centuries, but my gaze doesn't go back that far. You know what it's like these days. You can work where you want, you can live where you want, you can travel overseas, you can buy a BMW or 2 or 3, you can live in a big house, you can send your kids overseas to university and the like. And in other words, there's been a remarkable liberalisation in the private lives of the Chinese people, and I guess in their relationship and involvement in the economy. Now, Chairman Mao used to be identified with the idea and the phrase of continuing revolution, by which he used to keep all his enemies and the party itself off balance. But, I've been covering US politics now full-time for an hour and a half, and of course covering US politics, a year and a half, and covering US politics these days, one of the many things you've got to come to grips with is the LDS Church, or the Mormons. Now, the Mormons have, when they change their mind on a topic, they've got a great sort of way of describing that as well. It's called continuing revelation. And I think China is much more about continuing revelation these days, continuing revolution, because that's how the Communist Party basically, they've done an about turn on all, private business, entrepreneurs, wealth, inequality, foreign investment in state banks and IPOs and the like. So it's the continuing revolution has gone. Now we have continuing revelation, and that gives fantastic flexibility to the Communist Party. But throughout this process of the liberalisation or the partial liberalisation of the economy, the party has kept a tight grip on what I call the 3 Ps: personnel, propaganda and the PLA. And it's these 3 things sit there in some respect, at the heart of the system like kryptonite that you can't touch. And they're absolutely essential to party rule. Now, all of these different areas are in some respects fraying at the edges, but let me talk about them one by one very briefly. The PLA, of course, is not the nation's army, it's the party's army. If you ever read Western newspapers, there's often great concern about the politicisation of the army. If you read military newspapers in China, it's exactly the opposite. They rage against the depoliticisation of the army. And that's a very important thing for the party to remain in control of. The PLA, and I'm not an expert on the PLA, but certainly you can see one way that party control is fraying over the PLA these days is because a lot of institutions in China is becoming more professional, just like doctors, journalists, lawyers. They've a greater professional ethos. They want to do their jobs and the like. And so I don't think the party has lost control of the army, but the army's become a much more independent actor. I think it's got much more of a professional ethos. It's a much bigger actor in the budget process as it gets more money. And of course it wraps itself in the flag of patriotism as well, which gives it a big say and great freedom to move within the system. The second area, the second P, is propaganda. Now all media, including the internet, is under the party. Now obviously the media in China has changed enormously in the past 10, 20 years. I think the internet is the biggest driver of that. The second driver of that is commercialisation. In other words, the state press has to make money as well to survive, which is why you've got the People's Daily in one part of the People's Daily's stable and the Global Times in another part of it, which is enormously profitable. Now the internet, I think, has great uses for the central party. It allows them to keep check on a lot of corrupt local officials. I don't think they mind in Beijing in seeing people out in Hunan or Hebei or wherever being brought down occasionally by angry netizens, because it's a form of a check and balance within the Chinese system. And I think the control of the media in some respects is much more macro than micro. It's not like the Soviet Union where you have every article, somebody with a little red pen or something. But I would contend that the media never truly openly contests core policies about Tibet, Xinjiang and the like. They do not praise, well certainly in my time there, they don't praise democracies, and we'll come back to that. In fact, the opposite is the case. Now, another cardinal tenet is they don't attack top leaders directly. I wonder whether the Borton-Mosely case has upended this a little bit, because the conventional view about one reason why the party has made an official statement on this case so quickly the Shanghai Party Secretary Chen Liang knew some years ago it took months and months of a secret investigation for anything to be said. This time, with all sorts of rumours awash in Beijing, not just about Bolshoi, but about coups and things like that, and what had happened to Zhou Yongkang, the state security chief. There's been a really rapid response by the authorities, and quite a remarkable statement I'm sure you saw on television all the other night about what would happen to Bolshoi and also his wife. But having said that, I think the party may have been forced into that, but I don't think we should assume from that they sort of have lost control. I mean, it's a constant battle, I think, going on here, or that the system is about to come asunder. And I think they're working 24 hours a day to make sure it isn't. I don't know whether anybody saw on China Digital Times, which does a great job of digging out all the dictums of the propaganda department. And I saw today that they had a new list of words out in the last day which are banned on Weibo. I've got a sample of them here. British businessman, British housekeeper, political struggle, Chongqing. You wouldn't want to be booking a hotel there right now on the net. Inner struggle, US consulate, that's Chengdu, and usurp political leadership. So they're working away. Now, the third P, and I think is maybe has been least understood, or I think was least understood, that the party controls is personnel, which for all of us like me old enough to remember the old former Soviet Union is what we used to call the nomenclatura, or the list of names. In other words, the list of jobs which are reserved for top party people and which are passed through the organisation department in the choice of them. Now this bit is directly out of my book, so if you've read it already, I'm sorry, but I tried to illustrate this because, you know, people can't get their head around this outside of China, I think, that such a body should exist. So I tried to illustrate this by conjuring up an imaginary central organisation department if we had one in the United States. So if there was a similar body in the US, it would oversee the appointment of the entire cabinet, every state governor, the mayors of the major cities, the head of all minority political organisations, which I guess includes all the Indian casinos, the heads of all federal regulatory agencies, the chief executives of ExxonMobil, Citibank, Goldman Sachs, Walmart, and the 50 biggest companies. This is just the central level. The justices on the Supreme Court, the editors of every major paper from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal, and the bosses of the network and cable stations ranging from Fox to MSNBC. You can start to see why such a system is so attractive to politicians. On top of that, the body would oversee the chancellors and vice-chancellors of Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and dare I say it, Columbia. You're important enough to be a big, I would say, with the central organisation department, not the New York organisation department. And of course, the heads of all the big think tanks. CAS, for example, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which, as we all know, has got some terrific people working there and does great work. But the head of that, of course, is also appointed by the organisation department, which is why some old-timers at CAS still call CAS not a think tank, but they call it a department. Now, not only does the vetting for these jobs take place behind closed doors, but the appointments are also announced without any, accompanying explanation. You don't have this unseemly fight in the press beforehand about who's going to get the job. And I really loved it when I sort of, it's so obvious, simple things are the best. But when I realised the organisation department, at least until a year ago when I last checked, it doesn't have any listed phone number. It doesn't have a sign outside its office saying what goes on inside. They've got a fabulous banking office building west in Chang'an Xijie, just down from the propaganda department, down from Tiananmen Square. You can only ring up one number for the organisation department, and that's if you want to make a complaint about a cadre. So you can ring up and leave a recorded message. And that is for a body with just enormous reach and breadth. I'm not saying they decide everything. Obviously, it's a battleground within top leaders to get their people through this system, and it's a bureaucracy. But nonetheless, it's an extraordinary organisation, and in many ways keeps China together, I think. Finally, to cap out the internal system, we should mention the Central Discipline and Inspection Commission, which is the Anti-Corruption Bureau. Once again, it's an all-in-the-family operation in China. The party catches and kills its own, because to have it any other way, you have to have an independent investigatory body, and one of the cardinal tenets is the Communist Party is you have no centres of power outside the party. So we see in the Bo Xilai case, for example, it's been very interesting. Bo, I think, is now under investigation by the Central Discipline and Inspection Committee, but his wife is being handed over to the so-called judicial authorities, in other words, the police track. So his wife is not subject to party discipline, he is. It's an important distinction. As to the rule of law, I think China wants a modern economy. They looked around the world, they see that modern, prosperous economies have the rule of law, so they think, well, we'll have that as well. But I don't think they're having the rule of law because they woke up with some Montesquieu-like sort of revelation one morning and realised that they had to have a separation of power. It's much more utilitarian than that. They want it because it works, but they'll make it work within their own system. I always like to remind people, it's a little bit of a cheap shot, that the present Chinese Chief Justice does not have a law degree. He comes up through the Judicial Bureau. His predecessor, I think, was considered quite a legal reformer and was a very different character. But he, I think, is now or was under investigation in Guangdong for some kind of corruption. But in general, these apparatus of the party has removed itself, unless you're a dissident or unless you're being targeted in some respect, the party, I think, has largely removed itself from people's private lives. Somebody once described it to me, it's a bit like, somebody's left a radio on in the background. It's there, you can listen to it if you want. If something, big happens, they can turn it up and make you listen to it. But a lot of people in China can go about their lives without having anything to do with the Communist Party at all. Now, the sheer size of everything, of the party, like everything in China, always stuns. It's now got about 80 million members, and 1 in 12 adult Chinese, which incidentally is also about the ratio that you had in the old Soviet Union and its satellites. It's less clear, of course, how many active members there are. There was a period about 6-7 years ago when, in my stint in Shanghai, when I used to have to cover the Shanghai Stock Exchange, and there was a great moment then where there was a crossover point where the numbers of members of the Communist Party was exactly the same as the numbers of people with stock trading accounts. A terrific bit of synergy, but I think in many cases the stock trading accounts were held in fake names, and I just sort of wondered whether you could extend that analogy. I don't know what the latest figures are on that. Now, that's the control side of the equation in China. If that was all that China was, then it wouldn't be the success story that it is today. I don't want to make it sound like China is one sort of smoke-filled room. There's a lot of smoke-filled rooms, unfortunately, in China, but the political system and the economy is more than that. If China were purely obsessed with control, then it would have collapsed or atrophied a long time ago, like most other communist regimes. And the reason is that its obsessions run in a number of directions. One is keeping political power in the hands of the party. The other is creating a strong economy and adapting the mechanisms of governance and control to the much more complex realities of a country like China, modernising, and of its size. And that means they've undertaken extraordinary reforms which other communist countries weren't able to do, contemplate, or let alone bring off. Massive reform of the state sector in the 90s, early part of the 21st century, laying off about 50 or 60 million people just from the national level SOEs. To fight that atrophy that naturally and the cronyism that eats away in all political machines and their legitimacy, and the CCP is a political machine at the end of the day. they've tried to introduce some kind of performance culture into the bureaucracy. That's the sort of KPIs I was talking about before. There's a lot been written about, and I think it's a fashionable new trend in China watching, that with the likely orbit certain ascension of Xi Jinping to the party secretary's position, that China is run for the benefit of 100 big families and the like. I think that's a vast oversimplification. China is you look at Xi Jinping as a princeling, but so is Bo Xilai. Look what's happened to him. It's amazing. But in that respect, I think China is a funny mixture between an aristocracy and meritocracy. There's no doubt there's privilege and corruption, but I think corruption is an equal opportunity sport in China. You don't have to grow up in a well-connected family. And if you look at Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, they both come from nothing. So, if you add all that up, the party's genius is basically they've maintained the authoritarian powers of communism while dumping the ideological straitjackets that once came with them. And at the same time, they've somehow managed to hitch the power and legitimacy of a communist state to the drive and productivity of an increasingly entrepreneurial economy. And that, I think, is an achievement that not too many people would have predicted 30 years ago. At the same time, membership, the composition of membership has changed as well to reinforce that trend. Entrepreneurs are not only not shunned, they're welcomed with open arms. Of the 100-odd entrepreneurs, real billionaires on the Hurun rich list, when I last looked, about a third to a quarter are party members. Once they would have joined the party, I think, because it helped them locally, would have helped them get bank loans and helped them in various connections and the like. These days, I think the party is actively seeking them out. It's trying to colonise the private sector, or at least have its eyes and ears in every part of it. So the two become symbiotic. So if we come back to a more the US and China now, it's pretty clear that the Communist Party runs China, and in some respect you might say, so what? We're not living in the 50s and the time of Senator McCarthy. It's not. We don't have Reds under the bed anymore. The US seems to manage to get along very practically with all sorts of governments around the world. If the US can get on with the country as alien as Saudi Arabia, frankly, then surely it can get on with China. There's the realpolitik argument. If the Communist Party can keep a country of 1.3 billion people growing and stable, that is, that's not a bad feat, and I think many people in the US would be happy with that. There's a lot of talk about the so-called Beijing consensus, as though the Chinese system is exportable. I don't agree with that. It's cited as a worry for the West that the China system can be replicated. I think that's nonsense. Let me just give you one example to illustrate that. Could you imagine there being a central organisation department in the People's Republic of Congo? No, you couldn't. You simply cannot export the Chinese model and put it down willy-nilly in all sorts of other countries. The Chinese system is far more nuanced and has far too deep roots to just export it to other places. I'll come back to that. China, of course, is if not already, the predominant power, will be the predominant power in Asia. So what does this do for democracy in Asia? I'm old enough to remember the great debate in the 90s, chiefly led by Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore and Mahathir Mohamad in Malaysia, about how Asians were sort of different from everybody else, instinctively consensual, communal people, didn't like the din of democracy and all this noisy kind of Western stuff. Of course, if you look at Asia these days, Singapore and China, but Singapore is the exception. Asian democracies are messy and the like, but you've seen governments change hands peacefully in Taiwan, South Korea, even Indonesia, which doesn't have a great set of institutions to underpin it. Thailand's obviously gone through some ups and downs with democracy, but it still has elections and the like, and I don't think they could manage without it. You don't have too many coups there anymore. Look what's happening with Burma and Myanmar. Malaysia itself continues to liberalise and even get rid of the sort of Bumiputra anti-Chinese system, or try and modify it. So in other words, Japan, of course, in its own unique fashion, is a democracy and has great free speech. So in that respect, China is even not a model in Asia. The only country I think that remotely models China is Vietnam, which is also ruled by a communist party. But even they struggle to replicate what China has done. Vietnam often seems to me is like China in the early 90s, trying to get to sort of escape velocity in the next area of development, and trying to get inflation under control, which of course Zhurongji did in China with his brutal anti-inflation campaign. The Vietnamese have not been so successful. So why does it matter about what does the Chinese political system matter? Well, if China is not a model, I think it is an alternative system, which at this stage looks successful. And it's an alternative that provides succour and even support for any country that it thinks can avoid or put down democracy or democratic movements, and also have a fast-growing economy at the same time. It's also very important because it provides political support for countries which are shut out by the West. There's a long list: Zimbabwe, Sudan, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, Guinea, Iran. It is also, incidentally, of course, making US allies rich or richer, most obviously Australia, where I'm from, and Canada, both comfortably and uncomfortably for those countries. But I think the real point is that the political system does matter in terms of diplomacy. But for all of China and America's great pragmatism, I think there is a deep gulf between China and the US, and really between the West and China, and perhaps also Asia and China. Why is that? Well, the political system is vastly different, and don't the Chinese know it? Which is why the media in China has, under the propaganda department, has as one of its guiding lights the need to constantly denigrate Western democracy, and of course the US in particular, which is the most important Western democracy. Now, the Chinese system, I think, at its heart, is hostile to the West. Now, I don't mean the Chinese people. I don't even mean the government in its day-to-day operations. I don't mean all Chinese institutions. I also don't mean in a military sense, because I don't think China is an expansive power with any sort of missionary zeal like America is. But I think that it is hostile to the idea of Western democracy and Western dominance and Western democratic ideals, however besmirched they might have become in recent years. And frankly, in some ways, I think the Chinese are quite right to be suspicious of the West, or the Communist Party is quite right to be suspicious of the rest, because peaceful evolution, that old nostrum, I think, is a threat, long-term, to party rule. Aaron Freiberg of Princeton, I think, has a new book about this, and he says that, stripped of its niceties, the ultimate aim of the US is to hasten a revolution, albeit a peaceful one, that will sweep away China's one-party authoritarian state. I think I largely agree with that. I'm not saying that the US in all arms of government is working towards that end, but certainly I think that's the ultimate effect of US policy. The second point why China is different. The structure of the Chinese economy remains, even after all its reforms, remains vastly different. The state still dominates or even monopolises, and I'll read the sectors. Telco providers, not equipment, that's Huawei and ZTE. Telco providers, banking, oil and energy, petrochemicals, heavy industry, mining, aviation, ports, construction, healthcare, and about 70% of the auto market in foreign joint ventures. And all of these industries have been favoured in one way or another through access to capital, or at the very least, in some cases, restricted entry into markets. That wouldn't matter if it was happening in Malaysia or, you know, Kazakhstan or something like that. But if it's happening in the what is, I think, you know, will be the largest economy in the world in a matter of a few years, that sort of difference is very important. Now, what happens then when China's development is no longer underwritten by a peaceful international environment which is secured by Pax Americana, if you like, or by the US? I always think that people underestimate the importance of the US in the Asian economic miracle. All of those countries, of course, you know, how do I put this? You know, worked their whatevers off to get where they are. You know, there's been tremendous hard work, pressure, innovation in different ways in all those countries to get to where they are. But just think about this, you know, to put it crudely. The Korean Civil War is not over. The Chinese Civil War is not over. Sino-Japanese tensions continue in all manner of ways every other day. The only reason all these issues have been able to manage, and the tremendous economic miracle we've been able to see take place, is really because the US military has been there and has kept the peace. Now, I think that is obviously about to change. There's no way that China, I think, as a great power, a proud country, is going to want the US military to be dominant in Asia, as it has been for the past 30, 40 years, unless the US is willing to cede power to it, which I think is a very difficult thing for the US to do, conceptually. You know, can these two vastly different political systems with vastly different economies and vastly different sets of economic interests to protect at the same time, can they come to a new sort of pact in Asia? Will America sort of sell out, as it were, or cede different issues at the expense of its present Asian allies and Asian alliances? How does the party play into that? I mean, the party, I think, has two legs of legitimacy. The economy, which I think, for various reasons, is going to plateau in terms of growth eventually. Nobody grows at 10% forever. China will fall off a demographic cliff in about 2015, 2020. Already cities like Shanghai and Hangzhou and Guangdong and the like are no longer having the sort of 12% growth rates that they had when I went back there in 2000. Shanghai, when I went back there in 2000, had a target to grow 2% above the national rate. Now it's below the national rate, and it can't grow any faster. So once the economy comes off the boil to a degree, I don't think China's about to sort of, you know, I don't believe this coming collapse of China nonsense or anything like that. But, you know, it will come off the boil. You won't be able to buy, you know, if you're growing at 10% a year, you can buy a lot of people off. That gives you lots of room to move. That won't last for much longer. Then we get into the second sort of area of legitimacy, which is nationalism. And I don't mean patriotism, but nationalism. And I think once we have a China which are in the not easy, but the great economic gains that we can see annually at the moment are no longer there, and that the party gets its legitimacy more from nationalism, from economic success, then I think we have a much different ball game in Asia and a much different relationship between the US and China and a much different set of pressures on the party within China itself. And I think that's going to be very difficult to navigate. As to what I said, as to what's going to happen this year with the various elections and elections, I had to choose a title for my talk. I think this year, I think the party, there's no great, you know, I think we'll hear a bit of noise from Mr. Romney, a bit of noise from the president to sort of balance that out. I think the Chinese are pretty good at reading US politics now and will try and ignore that as much as they can. We'll get beyond this year and the different political cycles, but I think beyond that, it's going to get much, much more difficult. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard, for that. Now, rather than give my own commentary, perhaps I can open the discussion. And my role in this is the Harriman Institute members to try, although you've done this for me, insert some comparative element. And you're referencing the Soviet Union made me think a lot about the debates we had over the Soviet collapse and the nature of the Soviet system. Was it adaptable or wasn't it? Did Gorbachev just mess up in the implementation of this? And I think the consensus now is, if there is a consensus, but the strong works in the field point to the direction that the party and the system wasn't reformable. That once you started tugging on the string and introduced some reforms, that hastened the system's collapse, in part by generating incentives for elites to devour the system itself. One political scientists have used the metaphor of a bank run that brought down the Soviet system on these assets. So I guess my first question to you would be this adaptability, and I think you do just a wonderful job of pointing out all these sort of strategic moves that the party has made to learn and to develop sources of stability. But this fundamentally, this adaptability, this ability to insulate itself as a bubble, that's what just strikes me as remarkable. In your research and your reporting, what lessons has the party taken from the collapse of its counterpart? And how would you see those manifested in these various policies, strategies, perhaps even U-turns over the last couple of decades?
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty well... Is that on? Yeah. I think it's pretty well documented that this was a massive... that various Chinese institutes and the like studied this issue for 3-5 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union in '89 and '91 and the like. I always thought the Chinese attitude to the Russian reforms or Soviet reforms was summed up in just a few words, which I think are in Ezra Vogel's book about Deng Xiaoping, and it says that Deng thinks Gorbachev is an idiot. That's all you need to know. But I think it is amazing. People have always keep underestimating the Communist Party and what they've been able to do. And closer, right? Okay, is that better? I tend to mumble. For example, one of the great, I think, to give you one example, good example of how I think badly Russia does compare. Take the oil industry. And I'm not an expert on Russia or the Soviet Union, but you can see the impact of that. After the Soviet Union collapsed, it seems like about 3 or 4 people got hold of the oil industry in Russia, and that's why you see these oligarchs in London who own, Chelsea Football Club and the like. So the equivalent in China would be if a single person owned PetroChina, which is now, I think, I read the other day, the biggest oil producer in the world. I'm not sure about that, but anyway, it's up there. And so if you look at what they did with the oil, what they did in China when they had to reform the oil industry, they basically divided the country. They drew a line down the middle of the country. Northern China is oil production, southern China is oil refining, offshore is offshore. And you had 3 companies. And that they could then go into each other's markets and compete with each other. And that those companies are also listed on overseas exchanges, so they're meant, which gives them some sort of reporting requirements, which we have seen play out, I must say, in corruption cases involving their executives. And they're also expected to become globally competitive companies. I might say at the same time, PetroChina virtually was the Ministry of Petroleum previously. Now you have no ministry, and so you have little oversight. There's no doubt vast sort of corruption and the like within those companies, but other than that, their development has been quite remarkable. They have learnt by going overseas, they've made mistakes. They are very powerful, perhaps too powerful, in places like Sudan and the like. But China has basically built itself 3 globally competitive oil companies, albeit with great state privilege behind it, capital. whereas Russia still lives off oil in some respects, but it also has enriched, a number of people, the oligarchs and the central government. So I don't know whether, the big question about China is whether the state enterprises, which devour most of the capital of the country, which have had a resurgence since the financial crisis a couple of years ago, can still protect their privileges. Wen Jiabao made a statement the other day about shaking the state banks up, which is pretty important. So there has to be another big round of reform, but to get to where they are today, they've done very well. You can't hear? It's not working. No.
Either the mic doesn't work or you need to use the original mic.
Okay. So I'll
Okay.
stand up.
Okay. Sounds good. So let me just follow up on that regarding the organization, its capacity to learn. One thing that I'm struck as a China neophyte going into the Central Asia region is, on the one hand, this amazing learning capacity on some issues, especially in terms of the economy, finance and banking, regulatory issues, certainly in conduct of diplomacy overseas. And yet you mentioned these in your lecture, the kind of untouchable issues, Tibet, Xinjiang, and territorial integrity, Taiwan, and the like. And what accounts for these blind spots, these red lines? Why this duality between this party that can adapt, can learn, can mimic, can take what it thinks is useful and throw out the other things, and yet on these core issues of territorial integrity, we're seeing the same reactions, for instance, in Xinjiang to these increasing policies of settlement, of clamping down, and so forth. And yet there doesn't seem to be a lot of adaptability here. Why the difference between the two?
Well, you would say blind spot. They would see it with deep clarity. But I know what you mean. I think that it's as simple as issues of sovereignty. Since the Communist Party unified China, beat out the foreign invaders, beat the Japanese, restored the respect that the country had as a single entity. That these issues like Tibet and Xinjiang are taboo. I think it's a great pity, actually, and I think it's part within the system that it seems perhaps internally you can discuss these things more openly, but I'm not so sure about that, because you see the sorts of people who are appointed as the party secretaries of Xinjiang and Tibet and stay there for a very long time are very hardline figures, and it seems in that part of the policy-making apparatus, unless somebody at the top or a group of people at the top move, and that would be a very risky thing to do, certainly in public, it's very difficult to change policy there. And by that I don't mean undermining the sovereignty of Tibet or Xinjiang or various other places on borders, because I think that's a non-starter, but in getting better treatment of the people there. It's Tibet and Xinjiang just strike me as sad stories that are going to continue for a number of many more years, as far as we can see at the moment, because of the paranoia within the party, or the parts of the party which control those policies, that people like the Dalai Lama and the East Turkestan Front, or whatever they're called, want to break up China. And as far as I can see internally, party officials have very little room to move on that. It's about sovereignty, and it seems that the policy on sovereignty is held by a very dark part of the system.
Yeah. And then just one final area. I'm very pleased you brought up this issue of sort of U.S.-China relations and this question of the Beijing consensus as a model. And this is something that we talk about in class sometimes, sort of, is there a model that's replicable out there? And you bring this wonderful angle on it, that if you just think about this distinct beast that is the party, how in the world would you transplant that? But I think some of the things that fall under the Beijing consensus rubric are just common sense sort of policies, according to developing countries, that they want to hear, that they don't want political and economic conditionalities thrust upon them. They want to be the masters of their own sovereignty, that they want to have integrated development and assistance packages. You know, why do I have to take a pool of loans here and then development from here and then, oh, investments provided by the private sector, you know, and you can't pay me off privately? You know, you get everything, you know, one-stop shopping. That seems to me a very reasonable, pragmatic thing that China fosters. And finally, diplomacy. I can't help being struck that, you know, when, you know, certainly the part of the world I studied, you know, these leaders who are begging to get some time in the White House, and, you know, it usually doesn't. And so usually on these itineraries, they get time with deputy assistants. Maybe they'll hit a couple of the think tanks, maybe a university or two. And the Chinese just seem to be very skilled diplomats, that dignitaries from overseas and presidents meet with presidents. Foreign ministers meet with foreign ministers. So I see all of these things as potentially replicable and just perhaps even more sensible than the so-called Washington consensus. So I'd love to get your thoughts on perhaps how the Beijing consensus is translated domestically by a lot of developing countries, even though they realize that the party structure itself can't be mimicked.
Yeah, well, maybe the way I used the term Beijing consensus, I used as a little bit of a straw man to beat up on it. That's possible. I mean, I think China obviously has enormous lessons for developing countries about how to develop, about how to sequence development, about how, you know, China is very good at experimenting, about seeing what works. China has been very smart, I think, in not opening its capital account. They'll have to do it eventually, but there's no reason why China should have accelerated the marketization of its financial system. They're lagging now, but they're right to be cautious and not listen to Goldman Sachs and the like in 2006. So that's all true. As to, I mean, I think Chinese investment in Africa is a good thing. You know, I don't, you know, as a matter of principle, it's a good thing, and Africa is a coming place. China has a lot of resources it wants and needs there, and is trying to get them. That's fine. But when you get to this, you know, I think we're quite open to be, you know, Western countries don't have a great record in Africa. Perhaps you can argue that, but you can certainly argue about the conditionality of giving loans. I think it's not like it was, and I think the system of conditionality is different from what it was 15, 20 years ago. Whereas China, I think, seems to more be into sort of buying the system off. And already that has got blowback in places like Zambia and the like. You know, another thing which China is very good at is infrastructure. They've got a great stress on infrastructure, and they're building that in Africa as well. So, I mean, all I meant by the Beijing consensus is that, yes, that they're not going to replicate a communist, or, I mean, a lot of people from Africa, African leaders would no doubt love to stay in power forever and have their economy growing at 10%. Well, they can't do it. And just finally, are the Chinese great diplomats? They can be great diplomats, but they're not the masterminds that people would make them out to be. Just look what's happened in Asia, in the last Southeast Asia, with the South China Sea. I mean, there's a certain point in time where China can have 5 to 10 years of smile diplomacy in Southeast Asia, but that doesn't work forever. And it doesn't work when you've got claims like they have over the South China Sea. You can't sort of finesse your way out of that. Yeah, so they're good diplomats, but I'm not quite in the Kissinger school of sort of bowing down before them.
Great. So before we turn it over, just a thought connecting one of your comments to a previous lecture by Professor Steve Cocken, who was seen in the crowd here, talking as he was about the different styles between Russia and China. And I can't help noticing the contrast between the Russian response to the Romney campaign and the Chinese response to the Romney campaign. And I wonder what that tells us about the self-assurance and confidence of these two powers. That, you know, Medvedev was immediately, you know, sort of rebuked Romney sort of for his comment that Russia was the greatest geopolitical threat, whereas all this rhetoric doesn't seem to have elicited a public response from Beijing.
Yeah, well, I think when I lived and went back to China the second time from 2000, and every year we'd get a group of people from Congress through, and they would always, bang the table and say, "I told the Chinese this time that this, it has to change. They got the message, this, that, and the other." And every year, nothing would change because I think that the Chinese can see through that sort of bluster. I wonder when it becomes less than bluster. I mean, Romney, for example, Romney's big line is that on day one he will declare China a currency manipulator. And all that means, if you do that under US law, is you have to negotiate. That's all the law says. He can't, having declared China a currency manipulator, then slap tariffs on Chinese exports. I mean, imports. He could, but that would be manifestly against WTO rules. And I think it would cause an uproar in business in the US as well as in China. It's not a simple thing you can do. And I'm sure he understands that. At some point, though, I wonder when it becomes less than bluster, what provokes a genuine incident between the US and China. Congress always seems to be in one position and the administration in another position, on a bipartisan basis for the most part, as far as I can see. And people here would know a lot more about US politics than I, but every time China bubbles up under the surface as an election issue, but never really emerges as the big vote-changing issue. It doesn't have that salience. But one day it might. I personally don't think it's there this year yet.
Yeah. Terrific. Well, let's open up the discussion to the floor. Do we have any questions for our speaker? Only thing I would ask is that you identify yourself for Richard. Please. Oh, you have the microphone. Excuse me.
Well, first, thank you very much for your presentation. It was greatly interesting. My name is Parsifal De Sola. I'm a grad student at the Weatherhead Institute here at Columbia. My question is regarding your last lines weren't the most optimistic ones regarding the role of nationalism in China. Basically, well, the CCP's legitimacy has been based on economic growth and nationalism. But, well, this is nothing new. Nationalism has been deeply rooted in the state's history of propaganda. But there's this sense that this time around, there's little evidence that nationalism is officially orchestrated. For example, in 2005, Japan's bid for the UN Security Council. So in this future, which is not further away than from 10 years or so, how did you see this, we could call this rise of a bottom-up nationalism taking place or playing a role in Chinese foreign policy or Chinese domestic policy? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question and kind of hard one to answer. Certainly the foreign ministry, like foreign ministries around the world, but more so in China, at the end of the day, they're always getting pieces of chalk sent to them in mail, because they've got a weak backbone, to give them a bit of, calcium and the like. And they're under a lot of pressure to, stand up for China's interests. I remember distinctly the Japan protests in 2005. I used to live right next door to the Japanese embassy there. And you're right, there's a lot of bottom-up nationalism. That was started by a particular guy or group of people on the internet. And it welled up into, I think at the time, they would have been the biggest marches since '89 against the Japanese, and in Shanghai as well as in Beijing. But that's true, but I also was pretty interested to see that the government also managed to shut it down very quickly. They have that amazing capacity to send text messages to everybody in a certain area telling them to go home, which they did. They had a little chat to the anti-Japanese activist. They didn't lock him up or anything like that, but took him for a cup of tea, as they say, and just made him realise that it was worth his while to just let go of this campaign for a while. I think I'm trying to remember Japan changed prime ministers as well from Koizumi to somebody else. I've forgotten his name now. To the what's his name again? The young guy who came in and left. But anyway, on the day that the new Japanese prime minister came in, Hu Jintao immediately changed tack, put out a warm statement, invited him to China, and the leadership was able to turn on a dime, despite what you say is very strong feeling for all sorts of good and bad reasons, anti-Japanese feeling at the time. So, yeah, there's bottom-up nationalism, but I don't think the authorities have lost their ability to completely to manage it, and they can stir it up as well, of course.
Yes, please. Wait for the micro.
Thank you. John Koch, I'm a political historian, but I'm going to ask you a question about Chinese politics. Given the fact that China is a large country with a large population and area, I'm very interested in how power is delegated to the provinces, some 25 provinces. How do the arrangements range among these provinces with different size populations, different economic assets? What kind of formal or informal channels go back and forth between Beijing and the governors? How much latitude do the party secretaries, how much latitude do they have? Are they backstopped by party specialists in each of these areas? To the extent that you're conversant in these issues. Thank you.
It's kind of complicated, and it's. I mean, the so-called vertical fiscal integration, between the centre and the provinces. Frankly, I never get on top of that. In terms of fiscal transfers and the like, except that there's a long-running struggle going. Predating the Communist Party of managing provinces, tension between the provinces and the centre. The biggest thing that happened there, I think, from my memory, and some specialists in the room will call me out, no doubt, was there's a big tax reform in 1994 which basically gave the centre a much larger tax take and which gave them a much sort of greater say, I think, in policy. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the banking reform in late 1990s and early part of the 21st century, Zhu Rongji got hold of all the ability to make the centre appoint the top bankers in all the provinces, not all the banks, but mostly. That's very important as well because, as you saw, fiscal stimulus and the like comes through banks in China. So that was also greater centralisation of power. That's two things. The third, quite apart from that, the formal arrangements of the party. If you think of the system that I described, where you've got the organisation department and the propaganda department, the system you have at the party system at the central level is replicated at the provincial level, at the city level, at the township level, and the county level and the township level. And in general terms, the centre supervises the provinces the cities, and so on. And so you have this sort of cascading sort of set of supervision and relationship. But it's a bit of a moving target. To give you the flavour of one of the debates about how the centre can watch the provinces, there's been a big debate about who should appoint the anti-corruption chief in the provinces. Usually the provinces have done it, which in reality means that there's no supervision at all because the person who's the anti-corruption chief is ranked lower than the party secretary. And I think in the last couple of years, and I'm a bit out of touch, the centre has tried to get hold of that. But that's the general principle about how it's set up. Fiscally, China has been centralised on a number of fronts in the last 15 to 20 years. But having said that, they still have, if you're sitting in Beijing and you want to know how the money you sent out for education was spent in Hubei or a big city in Hubei, you still struggle to find out. And the resources for the central audit body to go and check on that, they always get a few big fish every year, are pretty small given the extent of what they're meant to supervise. I hope that's...
I guess it's going to come up at some point. So let's.
Bolshoi is a kind of different issue, I think. Bolshoi is, for want of a better cliche, a bit of like China's first or only big Western-style politician. He was campaigning very publicly to be on the standing committee of the Politburo. He's always been a bit of a limelighter. I met him when he was mayor of Dalian. He was, he was very flash then. When he was commerce minister, he was very successful in getting himself into the press by bashing the foreigners who he would negotiate as the China's chief trade negotiator. In theory, when he was taken out to Chongqing, he was a little bit sidelined. I think he'd wanted a different position. There's a lot of talk, and I guess about the Chongqing model and the Guangdong model, which I think is vastly overstated on one level. The Chongqing was not built by Bolshoi. If you go to Shanghai and you look at Pudong, the guy who built Pudong was out in Chongqing 10 years ago doing the same thing that he did in Pudong. So the guy who was in Pudong was moved to Chongqing, Huang Qifan, who's now the mayor. And he's the guy who really built the city. What Bolshoi did when he came in was to put this sort of political, I think, patina over it. He had the anti-corruption campaign, which embarrassed his predecessor, who was in Guangdong. And he had the Red Songs campaign, invoking the past innocent glory days of the revolution. And as far as I can see, that was going pretty well for him, because if of the 9 members of the standing committee, I think 6, except for Hu and Wen and Wu Bangguo, 6 of them, including Xi Jinping, had come out there and sprinkled holy water on his experiment by praising the Red Songs campaign. So it looked to me like he was well on his way to be elevated to the standing committee. But there's obviously a few things going on. They all keep dirt on each other as they go up. Most of the corruption cases are initiated by anonymous tip-offs. There was clearly a corruption case back from Dalian days that somebody was, handing around. But I suspect he could have withstood that if he hadn't had a falling out with his police chief. And once his police chief went to the Americans, I think that was utterly treasonous. That's the end of the road. Having your dirty laundry sort of handed on a platter to the Americans was beyond embarrassing. If you embarrass the system in China, the system will gobble you up. That's one thing. The second thing is this involves his wife, allegedly, not just, having a few offshore bank accounts and driving some peasants off land for real estate and shopping at Louis Vuitton in Hong Kong. It involves, in theory, murder of a foreigner. That is incredible. It's homicide. It's not just enriching yourself, which nearly all of them do. And so I think there's the 2 cocktails there, the Americans and murder, which is why this has been elevated into such an explosive issue. And it is amazing that he can be knocked off because he has such great revolutionary lineage and prestige, as does his wife. And you'd think he'd be able to fight back, but it looks from the statement the other day that he's not only finished, in other words, he won't just go to some ceremonial position in the CPPCC, but he's under investigation, which usually means he's will go to jail. So I think we haven't heard the end of it yet. That's my summary.
So let's take now a group of questions to make use of our remaining time. So let's, I think, start with 3 here. So yes, in blue sweater.
Hi, my name is Xu Wang. I'm a graduate student from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. My question is that with the economic reform happening in China over the past several decades, and people in China now believe the political reform will also take place to some extent. So my question is that, what's your suggested role of the United States in the process of China's political reform? For example, what U.S. government should do or could do about the China's political reform?
Great question. Gentleman in the red shirt.
Hi, Sam Baker. I work for a private consulting firm to institutional investors, and I travel a lot to China and Asia. Last night, Nick Lardy spoke across the room, and he was talking about his new book, Sustaining Economic Growth in China. He said what got him on this theme was when Wen Jiabao, talked in 2007 about the 4 uns of China's economy, which he said the economy is unsteady, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. So on one hand, you have a party that can seemingly make these decisions like Bo Xilai and protect itself or keep it, the system going despite entrenched interests. And then on the other hand, you have, the government saying it notices things, and conventional wisdom is that once China's leaders know something, they can fix it. But this is something they've been talking about for years and years and years. And granted, there's been a...
Sorry, can you formulate the question?
Okay, so the question is, why should we be optimistic that they will be able to implement reform, this next round of reforms?
Great. In the front, please.
So my name is Alessia Lefebvre. I'm the director of the Alliance program here at Columbia University. From what you say, it's very short, but China didn't collapse mainly because of the reforms that were successful. And you mentioned the professionalism of most of the institution going on. And at the same time, when you say the pillars of the legitimacy of the party, you mentioned the usual suspect: economic growth and nationalism. And it's very rare to read in the media or in the work of people that competency is a legitimacy of the party. Is it hard for us, Westerners, to acknowledge this competency, or what is your view on this? Thank you.
Great.
Yeah. Okay, first question about, I don't think the US has got a great role to play. And I also think that political reform, people read what Wen Jiabao says and they think, he's talking about Western-style democracy. I'm not cynical about it necessarily, but I think China, I tend to think China political reform is within the party. So the most important debate is within the party. And we shouldn't try and put the Western-style sort of matrix on it. As much as I might like that, it's not going to happen. In any way, I also profoundly hope that if there is reform in China, it goes at its own pace. Because if you had a revolution in China, if the Communist Party was toppled for whatever, it would be bloody and damaging and have a fallout all over the world. So the US, I don't think the US can do much, frankly. They might give money to an NGO here or there or something like that, but the US leads best by example. I mean, that's a whole other topic. But I think it's a Chinese, has been and will be a Chinese issue, and has to start within the party somehow. Yes, why Chinese leaders, the second question, yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question, actually. We all tend to think that they're kind of geniuses. They wave the wand and it happens and flutters around the country, whatever reform they're putting out. Like, Donald Rumsfeld's snowflakes, when you send little notes through the bureaucracy. But I think they are amazing in what they're able to achieve. But as you say, they've been talking about rebalancing the economy for 5 to 10 years. It hasn't happened. There are all sorts of forces why it won't happen because of the reliance on investment. I mean, China is not an export-led economy. It's investment-led. It's relied on exports less and less as the time has gone on, which is not to say they're not a competitor for the US, but it's very hard for them to wean themselves off this. It's particularly going to be fascinating next year because usually after every change of government, every 5 years, this is a big change, you have the party congress, then the government changes in the following February. And, the Chinese political cycle is, you can see it in the figures, there's usually a surge in investment in the first year of every 5-year government because that's how you get support. If you're a provincial party secretary or mayor or something, you spend money. But China, after the stimulus of 2008, is just not in a position to do that anymore. And there's too many people, I think, within the system, economists, who are against that. So yeah, I think it gets harder from here on in. Competency, yeah, I guess that's true. Competency it's a good way of putting it. I think they're very competent bureaucrats, but I guess competency for me is reflected in economic management, most of all. Less so in how they manage other issues, which will matter more once the economy comes off the boil. By that I mean how local officials and the like manage land management and moving people off their land, how you manage corruption issues, how you manage the sort of rent seeking by the very powerful interests and the like. So they can be competent up to a point, and they are empowered to act. They're empowered in many respects, but often empowered to act on behalf of the powerful. So I think if you can have competency on the one hand, but you've got to have a degree of independence or a real government as well. So, and in some respects, the Chinese competence comes from flexibility, because it's not like in America where you put one word out of place on a document and you go back to the bottom end of the queue again. It's horrible dealing with bureaucracy in America, I must say. But in China, because they're not ruled by law, because they're ruled by themselves, they can be very flexible. And it makes a difference.
Great insight. Okay, let's take one more rapid fire round. So yes, please. Yes.
Hi, my name is Max Seddon. I'm a graduate student at the journalism school here. I ask this question from the perspective of someone who knows a lot more about Russia than I do about China. You mentioned elite corruption, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on two fronts, how that affects, firstly, economic growth and economic development in China, and secondly, how that affects popular perceptions of the elite when you have scandals like the lavish lifestyle of Bo Guagua, Li Gang, and things, Li Gang's son, and things like that. Because in Russia, these are very significant, but China seems, from what little I know, to be very different. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. Thank you.
Great. Any more questions? Yes, all the way in the back. Yep.
I'm Tina from law school. The press keeps emphasizing how obsessed the party is with presenting the unity of their leadership, and I'm wondering if this is just more historical, carryover from Tiananmen, or this obsession is actually rational and there would be more discontent, riots, if there were the unity, if there wasn't as much unity being shown or represented by the party's leadership.
Great. That seems actually like the perfect way to end. So if you could address those two.
Yeah, so corruption, I don't, there's probably been various studies of this. I mean, I don't think corruption is not so great clearly that it disables the whole economy as it did, say, in Suharto's Indonesia or something like that. I don't know so much about Russia. In some respects, I'm sure there's a classic, pol sci theory about this. It's a bit of a transaction tax, everybody gets a cut. And if you abuse that, and if you ride roughshod over people, and that's what happened in the Shanghai scandal in 2005, if you get too greedy, then I think that's when you get vulnerable to getting in trouble. How does it affect popular perceptions? Yeah, I think that is a massive corrosive factor in the way that people look at their leaders, and they constantly acknowledge that. But until you've got some independent oversight mechanism and not simply a party graft body, you can never do anything about that. For example, in the case of Bolshoi, as I understand it, bureaucratically, for somebody at his level, at the Politburo level, to be put under a formal investigation, there has to be a consensus at the next level up. So every big corruption investigation is a political decision. And so that necessarily hampers it. And it means nobody fixes a problem, but you never get on top of it in a genuine fashion. Party unity, well, you kind of put those two things together. I mean, the reason why there's such an emphasis on party unity is precisely because of the street demonstrations in 1989 when it got out of control. I think that was the existential moment for the party, when there was a visible split at the top, and the party came as close to losing power as they have I guess, since 1949. Borton-Mosely case is different, of course, because in many respects he's a popular figure. There's no great street protest. There's no sort of rising up in the capital or anything like that. I think the party leaders, though, think in some respects along the lines of your questions. We can't have any divisions because they would cause people to rush out. I think they basically treat the population as a very sort of immature polity. We can't have any differences because the place will just explode. Maybe they're right, but I don't think they're doing much to sort of, change or reform the system in such a way that that wouldn't be the case.
Well, Richard, we've certainly put you through your paces here, and we're really thankful for this terrific feast for thought. And on behalf of Harriman, I want to thank you for coming, and Myron too. Long may this collaboration keep going.
Thank you.